I have seen many hospital facilities where the HVAC systems are basically breeding grounds for biological contaminant, biological growth, mold, mildew, fungus, things of that nature. And what I have seen is the occurrence of those issues, particularly inside air conditioning units, particularly in the cooling coil cabinet areas where you've got moisture from condensate, you've got a dark, cold environment. The coils can load up with dirt if the filters aren't clean, and of course that creates the perfect breeding ground for mold.
What if one conversation could save a life? What if one new process or new product could save a patient from surgical harm? Broadcasting from a hospital basement near you, you are listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the global voice of sterile processing. Each week we spotlight the best practices, products and people from around the world who are disrupting our profession and helping you fight dirty. Every instrument, every time. Join us as we have the kinds of conversation that matter and give our industry the kind of voice that it deserves. Nyt on aika mennä puhdastakin puhtaammaksi. And now it's time to go beyond clean.
This week on Beyond Clean, we speak with David Schurk, Strategic Account Manager in Healthcare for Carrier West, based out of Denver, Colorado. He is a licensed designer of engineering systems and has over 35 years of experience in the design and analysis of heating, ventilating, and air conditioning systems for a variety of market sectors with a special focus on healthcare facilities. He is an LEED-AP and has been involved in the conception, design, and selection of systems for over 10 projects achieving LEED certified status. He is also a certified energy manager, a certified demand side manager, a certified water efficiency professional, a certified sustainable facilities professional, a board certified indoor air quality manager, and is healthcare constructor certified. He is active in ASHI, a member and serving on the ASHI editorial advisory board, ASHRAE, a past chapter president, current member, and serving on TC 9.6, the Colorado Association of Healthcare Engineers and Directors, the Houston Area Association for Hospital Engineering, the Texas Association of Healthcare Facilities Management, the California Society of Healthcare Engineers, the Association of Energy Engineers, and several other industry associations. David has authored various technical articles for a number of industry trade magazines and is a featured presenter at regional and national industry events. And Hank, certainly this man has the credentials to be our very first guest to talk about air quality, something that is really coming up a lot in the media these days and something that people are really looking at and saying, how do we make sure that something like that doesn't happen to us?
That is the beauty of Beyond Clean, Justin, that we get to find the folks in the industry who really know the ins and outs. They have the answers to the questions that we're asking inside our industry. And I'll tell you again, one of the best ways to get an invite to come on Beyond Clean is give great content and education on LinkedIn. I found Dave on LinkedIn. He actually shared a video of an air conditioner on a plane, and it was the one that kind of goes down by your feet, and there's like all this little fog coming out, and he was asking, hey, does anyone know why that's going on? I'll tell you why it's going on. And I noticed that he was in healthcare, and that sparked my interest. And wouldn't you know, he knows all that there is to know about temperature, humidity, airflow in surgical services, and that's why we brought him on the show. So a cue to everyone else out there that's listening, if you want to come on Beyond Clean to share your expertise, start posting on LinkedIn. I will find you, #sterile processing.
That hashtag has been growing tremendously. So you're right. Get on LinkedIn, #sterile processing, and you're going to hear from Hank Balch. As a reminder, you can subscribe to Beyond Clean on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and Spotify, or search for Beyond Clean on your favorite podcast application. We can also be heard on the Sterile Education app, available on iTunes and Android. Follow Beyond Clean on Twitter at Beyond Clean Info, Facebook.com/Beyond Clean Podcast, LinkedIn.com/company/Beyond Clean, or Instagram Beyond Clean Podcast. Find our videos, including Fighting Dirty with Hank Balch, Real Talk with Bob Mars, and Beyond the Headlines with Mike Matthews at youtube.com/Beyond Clean. Beyond Clean also offers social media and podcast consulting for vendors, along with survey preparation and remote consulting services to hospitals, surgery centers, and clinics. For more information, email info@beyondclean.net. Finally, Beyond Clean is moving to a new format for issuing CE credits for our podcast. Beginning this season, we will be certifying the entire season of 8 episodes all in one. That means just one quiz at the end of the season for all the credits on one certificate. We'll be right back after a short break.
You're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
Joining us now is David Schurk, Strategic Account Manager in Healthcare for Carrier West. And this episode is cleverly titled Air Traffic Control. Dave, we're really excited to have you on. We were saying before we began the interview that we've done well over 100 episodes. It's actually quite shocking that we have not talked about the management of airflow and humidity and temperature in surgical services. So we're really happy to be bringing this content to the listeners today. Thank you for joining us.
I'm thrilled to be a part of this. Thank you.
So let's start with the importance of air conditioning in the surgical environment of care. I know most of our listeners, many of them have a background in sterile processing, and they're very keyed in to air exchanges and positive pressures. But let's talk about it in the entire suite of services.
All right, great. Well, from that perspective, a couple of things you just mentioned. There obviously are code compliance issues. ASHRAE, which is the American Society for Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers, has their standard 170, and that's kind of the, I guess in the industry, we consider that to be the backbone of ventilation codes for hospitals in general. And then, of course, there is the Facility Guidelines Institute, or FGI, and they have their design and construction of hospital and outpatient facilities guidelines that hospitals and constructors have to follow as well. A part of that is ASHRAE Standard 170, and ASHRAE Standard 170 goes into detail with regards to things like temperatures and relative humidities, pressurizations, air changes, et cetera, et cetera. But with regards to air conditioning of operating rooms in particular, that standard calls for temperature compliance, or temperatures to be able to be maintained between 68 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit with relative humidities between 20 and 60%. Now, those are the code compliance standards that need to be followed. And at the end of the day, the concept behind those is to provide environmental conditions that contribute positively to patient response and recovery. But sometimes those code requirements and those standards conflict a little bit with comfort requirements. And it's also important, of course, to keep doctors and staff comfortable and to also avoid issues in the OR with, humidity-related issues with mold growth and static electric discharge and things of that nature. So all of that comes into play. And I guess in a nutshell, that's, kind of encompasses the importance of air conditioning for operating room environments.
Now, Dave, so you mentioned mold, and I don't want to get us too off track here, but, in the news over the last couple of weeks even, we have seen a number of facilities across the U.S. in different climates who are dealing with mold challenges in their operating rooms. Can you speak to maybe like what's going on with that? Of course, in the sterile processing industry, that's not necessarily our purview, but I would assume that on the inside of your industry, that's not an uncommon occurrence, even though it may not get to the level that it has in these operating rooms in Dallas and in Seattle. But can you give us a little perspective or insight into to the causes and maybe some of the solutions? What's going wrong there?
Sure. Well, I don't want to speculate, specifically or particularly with what's going on in either of those locations, both Seattle and Dallas. But I will say that I have seen many hospital facilities where the HVAC systems are basically breeding grounds for biological contaminant, biological growth, mold, mildew, fungus, things of that nature. And what I have seen is the occurrence of those issues, particularly inside air conditioning units, particularly in the cooling coil cabinet areas where you've got moisture from condensate, you've got a dark, cold environment. The coils can load up with dirt if the filters aren't clean, and of course that creates the perfect breeding ground for mold. So I see that, I won't say every hospital I go into, but I will say a majority of the hospitals that I go into have some type of an issue like that occurring in their HVAC systems. And these HVAC systems, of course, serve every square foot of hospital facility. So, you can imagine that any air that's passing through those coils over that mold, if any of those mold spores and or mold material is delivered through the HVAC system, through the ductwork and into the occupied environment, it can create issues. In addition to that, some environments from time to time will have issues with condensation actually occurring in the space itself. And there's a whole dynamic behind why that happens. But when that does happen, again, you've got a source of moisture, which can create the perfect environment for mold to proliferate and grow.
Wow. I don't want to get too nerdy here for the medical device side of things, but it really reminds me a lot of the way that biofilm seems to work inside medical devices. We got the same environment in there. We got moisture and we have growth. Obviously, it's a different type of growth, but at the end of it all, the end result being we don't want that to continue to grow and want to, number one, identify it, and then number two, make sure that we have the proper tools to get rid of it. So that's helpful insight, but then it's also a little scary to think that it's in so many facilities and the risk is high, especially when you're talking about the impact into the surgical suite. To keep us back on track, though, you were talking about the regulatory framework, for the HVAC dynamic here. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about all the different variables that are involved, or at least a handful of the primary ones, in determining and describing what qualifies as compliant environmental controls. Because, of course, in SPD, as Justin mentioned, there's a lot of talk about temperature. We're comfortable with humidity in some regard, and we understand a little of the interplay between negative and positive pressure, but I have a feeling that's still scratching the surface of everything that comes into play.
Yeah, it can get pretty complex. And particularly when you consider the stock of existing hospitals that are out there, and then those hospitals have add-ons that have been constructed over, the last 20 or 30 years up until present date when they're actually adding on to existing hospital facilities. So you've got a mix of construction types, you've got a mix of building age, you've got a mix of HVAC systems that are supplying, environmental control for those environments. And then you've got a mix of HVAC technologies on top of that. You've got DX or direct expansion type equipment. You've got chilled water equipment. You've got desiccant equipment, both solid and liquid. Each has specific capabilities, specific strengths, and specific weaknesses with regards to what they can actually accomplish and how they need to be controlled. Each of these system types require very specific controls and very specific control sequences, and they're not necessarily interchangeable. And when you take a building and you add on to it and you go from system A to system B and you try to control the new system B, which may be a completely different HVAC technology than what was installed in the original building, and you try to control it with the same control system using the same control algorithms and same control sequences, it can create a lot of problems. And there are just some systems that work well and some systems that don't work well. And unfortunately, you get some of the systems that aren't working well and no one can quite figure out why, and they blame it on the building automation system or the control technology or interface, and that may not be the case at all. So it becomes a dilemma of making sure that what you have works with what it is you're going to add on to it, And unfortunately, many times, more times than not, what you actually have may not have been designed right, may not be applied from a HVAC technology perspective quite properly, may not be controlled quite right. So you've got environments that are just missing the mark. And no one can figure out why, and it is difficult and it is complex, but at the end of the day, you've just got to break it down into its basic components. For an HVAC system to be compliant with both code standards and creating comfortable environments within the healthcare facility, it's important, obviously, to make sure that the HVAC technology that's being installed can make the mark when it comes to the temperatures and relative humidities, the pressurizations and things of that nature that are being expected of it. And that, of course, the proper controls and control sequences have been included with that system so that at the end of the day, it can function up to its total capability.
So, David, with all the complexities that are involved with these systems, what are some of the most common problems that you see in the sterile processing departments when you go into hospitals? Well,
some of the probably the most prolific problems, if you will, are the ones that may not be quite noticeable when you walk in. And from that, what I mean is I think one of the biggest problems in hospital environments themselves, or the biggest latent problem, if you will, is just the cleanliness of the space, the cleanliness of the air, based on the type of HVAC system that is providing environmental control and what's going on within that HVAC system, as we referenced earlier, with mold growth and coil cabinets and things of that nature. Beyond that, particularly in sterile processing, what I see are some of the same issues that are being experienced in operating rooms. Like ORs, they require a program for management and measurement of proper temperature and relative humidity, things of that nature, and with regards to the FGI guidelines. But in sterile processing environments, they only list maximum temperatures and relative humidity requirements. And cool and dry requirements may actually be preferred above and beyond what's listed in the standards, because the people that are working in those sterile processing environments are typically heavily garbed and they're working hard. So they have issues with trying to maintain comfort. They sweat underneath their gowning. The environment needs to be dry enough to be able to absorb the perspiration off their skin through their gowning into the environment. And many times the sterile processing HVAC systems are not designed to be able to obtain or maintain those lower relative humidity set points. Very similar to the same issues we see in operating rooms.
Yeah, that's a great point. You know, recently we just had an update to the AAMI document, in the 2017 AAMI document, to be specific, and they basically took the recommendations out and said that we need to refer to ASHRAE now. And the argument that we heard was that the systems on hospitals are just not strong enough or good enough to maintain those lower temperatures and lower humidities. Is that what you're talking about when you say that?
That's exactly what I'm talking about. If you look at sources such as the American Society for Healthcare Engineers, ASHE, they'll tell you that the typical hospital in the United States is operating with a central chilled water plant temperature of about 42 degrees Fahrenheit. And 42 degree Fahrenheit chilled water just is not cold enough to be able to dehumidify the environment to lower relative humidity set points. So while it may be very capable of maintaining, say, 60 degrees Fahrenheit in an operating room, that 42 degree chilled water will only dehumidify so far, or so deeply, if you will. And that 60 degree Fahrenheit environment will probably be maintaining a relative humidity somewhere between 65 and 70%. And that obviously is out of code compliance for the operating room. And as well, it creates a cool and kind of clammy environment, which is probably less comfortable than one that's a little bit warmer at a lower relative humidity. So it's a bit of a dilemma. The existing infrastructures in hospital facilities just aren't designed to be able to do the lower temperature and relative humidity combination. And that's the important thing, to take temperature and humidity into account, one with the other.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the point about the comfort of the staff being an important point here. So it's not just being compliant. It is about trying to keep the team in there who are trying to focus on patient care also comfortable. And even if it's in sterile processing where there are no patients, there is still a big need, to keep those folks back there, like you said, who are heavily garbed and oftentimes working in a decontamination area that is just far too humid and hot to really be comfortable in any manner. And I know, I remember the days, all your PPE on and a plastic visor and sweat, fogging up your visor to the point where you couldn't even clearly see what you're doing. And that, like, whatever is going on, if it's the facilities not investing in the proper technology or what have you, like, that is definitely something that still needs addressing, because it is a systemic industry problem. There are very few decontamination areas that we see today that if you ask the staff, are you comfortable back here during the day when you're working, that you're going to get a positive answer. Almost everyone is going to say, no, not yet.
Absolutely. And I do have the opportunity at times to talk to surgeons, and surgeons will tell you specifically and quite readily that when they are comfortable in the operating room environment, they're obviously more focused and more productive. And of course, for them, when they're more productive, the patient response and recovery is better. And when that happens, they attract more patients, and they in the hospital make more money. But I think it holds true as well that for anyone working, when you are not comfortable, you are not as focused and you are not as productive as you would be if you were comfortable. So regardless of what the staff is doing in the hospital space environment, if they're not comfortable, they won't be as productive. And if they're not as productive, things may not be done quite as well as they should be. So, comfort is a key component in my personal opinion. And of course, if you talk to staff, they'll let you know it's definitely a key component in their opinion as well.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I guess I'd like to move now from comfort to crazy. All right. So one of the craziest things, and I have seen and heard this now in a number of different hospitals across the U.S., and I'm sure you have seen it and heard it 100 times more than I have, but it's this crazy experience that it literally starts raining in an operating room. So for those who are listening to this podcast, you may think that I'm joking, but there will be water coming from the ceiling in an operating room suite. And my question to you, who this is your world, right? So what's going on with those environmental dynamics to create this scenario that you have it's not actual rain, but you have water coming down out of the ceiling in a room as if it's raining in the OR?
Yeah, and I see this all the time, and it's a relatively complex psychrometric dynamic, but I will not bore the audience with that. I'll try to paint a picture of what's occurring if I can, so you just have to kind of follow along with me on this. Okay, so let's say it's a warm July day, and you're sitting outside at the picnic table, and your better half reaches in the refrigerator, pulls a cold can of beer out of the refrigerator that's at maybe 40 or 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and brings that outside to you and sets it to you next to you on the picnic table. And you wait a minute or two, and you look at that can, and the can is sweating, or at least it appears to be sweating. What actually has happened is that the cold can has come in contact with the air that surrounds it, and that air is full of moisture. Now, the can has been chilled to a temperature that is below what's called the dew point of the air. If you think of dew on the grass in the morning, that's exactly what I'm talking about, the dew point. So that what actually happens is the can has chilled the air to the point where the air can no longer hold the moisture that's in it, so the moisture will actually condense on the outside of the can. Very similar to what happens with a cooling coil. When we create a cold coil surface and we run warm, moist air across that coil, the coil condenses the moisture out of the air. So that's actually what's happening on that can. So the same thing can happen in an operating room where the room itself has been air conditioned and all the surfaces within that operating room have been chilled to a certain temperature. And then something goes wrong with the operating room HVAC environmental control system, or the controls, or the actual ventilation system, or something of that nature, where air enters the space that is warmer and moister than it should be. So what happens is the space now becomes the beer can, and that moist ventilation air hits the surfaces of that operating room that have been chilled below the dew point temperature of the air, and the moisture condenses on the surface. So it'll condense on walls, it'll condense on ceilings, on supply grills, on instruments, on scopes and lenses, everything. And all of a sudden, you've got an environment where moisture actually has condensed and begins to drip from surfaces. And obviously, at that point, the patients have been compromised. The docs are mad as hell. The potential for mold growth has now occurred in the space. So the space has to be reconditioned before it can be reused. So they have to shut the OR down and scrub it. And in some locations, like where I'm at here in Colorado, the surgical patient and the patient's family have to actually be informed of the event, and the patient has to be monitored for the next 6 months to ensure that no resulting, surgical site infections or hospital-acquired infections occur. So it is a disaster when it happens, to say the least. It's very avoidable if the HVAC system is designed and controlled properly, but it happens everywhere, every day of the year, somewhere in the country, and probably in multiple locations. I hope that kind of gives you a visual picture of what's occurring.
Yeah, that makes total sense, David. The beer example even made it help me understand it even better.
That usually helps everyone understand things better, especially if you drink the beer.
So it's really interesting. I wanted to kind of transition. At Beyond Clean, we do consulting in sterile processing, and it kind of takes us up into the operating room at times, but we focus on sterile processing. And when we're there, we like to check for documentation that they're monitoring temperature and humidity. How do you recommend that facilities do that? Through continuous monitoring? Do they do user monitoring? Check the temperature and humidity the same time every day? What's the best way to monitor that temp and humidity in these departments?
I think the best way, obviously, is an automated system of continual measurement, monitoring, and recording. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that healthcare facilities have to do that by the letter of the law. I see it done in all ways, shapes, and forms. I see it done manually. I see it done on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis. And, of course, I see facilities where they don't do it at all. But I think at minimum, space pressurization, whether it be positive or negative, and the surrounding space pressurizations should be constantly measured and recorded and verified. And in addition, I think temperature and humidity, and then indirectly from those two measurements, you can monitor dew point temperature, should receive the same consideration. I think it's just important, and particularly with regards to the two instances we talked about most recently in Seattle and Dallas, where they're having mold growth issues in their ORs. I think it's very important in ORs and sterile processing that we be able to look at those temperature and humidity set points anytime we want to, and make sure that we have created an environment where condensation in the space cannot occur. So from a liability standpoint, I think we've just seen the tip of the iceberg with regards to what will be required from a compliance standpoint, from a measurement and verification standpoint. And I think you're going to see the facilities that are doing this kind of haphazardly on their own have to step up and implement some type of a building automation system that does continuous monitoring and recording all the time.
Well, we're all about continuous monitoring. We've had several topics along those lines, just in different areas, not so much in the air quality and control of humidity, et cetera, but definitely relative to exposure and employee safety. So that's a hot topic for us. And a lot of times we get pointed in the direction of resources that can help people learn more about what the risks may be. And so I'd like to tee that up as we're wrapping a very eloquent interview with you, Dave, by the way. Where can the audience... Oh, you're very welcome. You've done a very nice job. Very concise, and on a topic that I think is not always super easy for people to understand. But I think you've done a really good job of laying it out there today. But where can the audience get more information on these topics?
Well, there's lots of reference sources out there. I think two of my favorite, of course, are ASHE, the American Society of Healthcare Engineers, and ASHRAE, the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers. ASHRAE in particular has a abundance of design manuals for whether it be generic HVAC systems and or more specific more specifically hospital HVAC environmental control systems. I actually wrote an article for the last ASHRAE Journal magazine in October of 2019 on hospital room operating room environmental control. I'd be happy to share that with anybody that wants to reach out to me. I also wrote a engineering newsletter for Carrier based around the air conditioning for the environment of care for hospital applications and things of that nature. But ASHE is a great source. You can go online and reference their books and materials area on their website. Same with ASHRAE. Whether you're a member or non-member, you can still order their materials, and they've got some phenomenal information out there that is, very, very user-friendly and very directed to help the HVAC design professional apply equipment properly and to design environments that can be controlled and maintained for ultimately providing the best environment of care for the patient.
And before we wrap, can you just tell everybody who's listening what the acronyms ASHE and ASHRAE stand for?
Sure. ASHE is the American Society of Healthcare Engineers, and ASHRAE is the American Society of Heating, Air Conditioning, and Refrigeration Engineers.
Excellent. So if they search those acronyms, they'll be able to find more information. And Dave, this has been an amazing interview. Really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing such a wealth of knowledge that you have.
My pleasure. I've enjoyed it.
That was David Schurk, Strategic Account Manager in Healthcare for Carrier West. And Bob, really smooth interview and not a topic. I can't believe we haven't talked about this really to any degree over, like we said in the intro, 100+ episodes. It's kind of shocking and very timely interview when you consider everything that's going on in the news lately.
Yeah, timely for sure. It's been crazy seeing all the articles pop up around the country with hospitals that are dealing with mold. It was amazing to me how easy he was able to explain it and really put it in layman's terms for us, because it could really be a confusing topic.
Yeah, and you did a good job bringing up Amy, too, because I know so many of our listeners are always looking to Amy. As a matter of fact, in New Jersey, it's law. So I appreciate you bringing that to the table during the interview as well.
Yeah, we had quite a bit of discussion surrounding it at the Amy meeting, so I think it'll really be timely for a lot of folks.
Excellent. All right. Well, that's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and Spotify. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. And if you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on a future episode, or if you'd like to share a picture anonymously on our Instagram page, just send an email to info@beyondclean.net. On behalf of Hank, Bob, and myself, thank you for listening to this week's edition of Beyond Clean.